Welcome to Deconstructive Criticism. My name is Aaron Flam, and this episode's guest is Thaddeus Russell. Today we will be discussing how prostitutes, drunkards, and renegades built modern civilization, if work ethic is something good or bad, and if Eleanor Roosevelt was a mass murderer or not. But first I want to thank you for supporting Deconstructive Criticism via Patreon, where you will find me by searching for my name, Aaron Flam, that's Aaron with one A and Flam with one M, PayPal, Bitcoin, or SWISH 0768 943737, 0768 943737. Every donation helps, and you will find links to your preferred way of support in the description of this episode regardless of what platform you're using. There is also a link to my webpage aaronflam.com, where you will find t-shirts with uplifting messages such as "Crush Socialism, Socialism is Evil" with a heart emoji after the text, so you and others remember that it is the ideology we want to crush and not its adherents, or "Your feeling are hurting my thoughts" t-shirts and hoodies, which is this podcast's creed, by the way. Your feelings are hurting my thoughts. At aaronflam.com you will also find my book, This is a Swedish Tiger, albeit not in Swedish for now. This is a Swedish Tiger reveals what the Swedes really did during the Second World War and how, via cooperation with Islamists, never really stopped. By the time you hear me say this, the English translation is done, but I'm still looking for publishers in different countries. This is a Swedish Tiger has sold out 2 editions in Swedish by now, so finding publishers in other countries shouldn't be too hard. The audiobook in Swedish will be released by the end of February, and the ebook around the same time. All will be available on aaronflam.com. These last few weeks of beginning of February 2020, Swedish media has not been fretting over the young men getting shot in the streets of Sweden, opting to instead focus on violence against women in Spain. Nor have they said anything about the wave of robberies of young ethnic Swedes by gangs of predominantly immigrant Swedes or children thereof, since that would be racist. According to the prevailing logic, or rather lack thereof, racism can only come from the majority population towards the minority and never the other way around. And that is how robbing a fellow human being and peeing in his mouth makes the urinator into the oppressed and his victim into the oppressor, regardless of how confusing it must be for both oppressor and oppressed that the act of urination into someone else's involuntarily open mouth has suddenly become a symptom of the aggressor's oppression. I'm sure the child in question would object to the conclusion of this type of intersectional analysis if his mouth wasn't filled to the brink with lukewarm piss. No one has barely mentioned the fact that Stockholm now has a net out migration. More people are moving out of the capital than into it, something you would think an important problem for a capital city. But no one has had time for such bad omens, since both sides of the social democratic political scale instead spend their time accusing the other of being liberal. The left accuses the right of being liberal fascists, while the right hurl accusations against the left for being liberal socialists. Neither is true, of course. Here in Sweden there are just 2 big groups of collectivists, but this is what happens when you change the meaning of words. A few decades after you start doing that, the confusion is complete and all-encompassing. Instead of battling this or a myriad of other problems, they have instead decided to focus on a commercial for Scandinavian Airlines. The commercial has triggered the right by claiming that everything great in Sweden came from someplace else, or, quote, elsewhere, end quote, as the commercial states. What is truly Scandinavian, asks the commercial the viewer, and then adds, absolutely nothing. Everything is copied. It concludes as if copying things couldn't be an original trait for a culture. As far as anyone knows, the Swedes may have invented copying others, couldn't they? Not that it matters. For if it is one thing that a true Swede can't stand to hear is that Swedish meatballs came from, quote, elsewhere, end quote. Ridiculous, I know, but also ironic, considering that the same people now laughing at the right for not wanting to admit influences from the outside world in the development of Swedish culture are the same people that would never admit that gang rapes with streaks of torture or peeing robbery victims in the mouth and then uploading it online could have anything to do with outside influences or, to put it plainly, ethnic violence. As per usual, the chattering classes are focused solely on what is said and not what is actually happening, which is why it keeps getting worse. Thaddeus Russell has been a professor of history, American studies, and philosophy at Columbia University, Barnard College, the New School for Social Research, Eugene Lang College, Occidental College, and Willamette University. He is also the author of A Renegade History of the United States and the host of the Unregistered podcast. Links to his webpage and online university can be found at aronflam.com, and although I don't agree with him regarding his theories on work ethic, America's contribution in World War II, or how to relate to fringe phenomena, I have been aggressively curious about his upbringing as a socialist in the United States of America, and I do agree that the rogues, drunkards, and outcasts of humanity has both been neglected in traditional history and that their contribution has been undervalued. I just think that embracing the fringe normalizes them and makes them, to be quite frank, boring. I was also very interested to hear his view about labor history in the United States, because that is what Thaddeus Russell's dissertation was about. Our lack of consensus is exactly what makes this a fantastic conversation. And now, Thaddeus Russell. Enjoy. Usually I start out with a very broad question because I'm an individualist.
I see a lot written down in longhand, which is scaring me. a lot of notes here.
There are some. This is not unusual for me, so it's not like I'm coming after you in a hard way. This is just a light conversation.
I love a well-prepared man.
All right. Well, do you really? Because I've done my research and I don't think you do.
We'll find out, won't we?
Yes. So usually I start with a very broad question and let you define yourself. So who are you?
Who am I? Ouch. That's like the hardest question ever. What do you mean, who am I? What level of abstraction do you want here, Aaron?
As much or as little as you want, because it says a lot about you, I think, if you delve into what you do, or if you say, well, I enjoy skiing in the weekends, or...
God damn it. Okay. All right.
I will get way more specific later on.
Okay, good. That would be helpful for me. It's not all going to be like this.
No.
Good. All right. I mean, it depends on what you're interested in, but in terms of my sort of formal credentials, what you might see on my books or in my articles in the byline is that I am a former academic. I guess I still am an academic, but a PhD in history, specializing in American history. Got that at Columbia University 20 years ago. Taught as an academic, a regular academic, in about 6 different colleges and universities in the United States during that time, specializing in history, but also in philosophy somewhat. I am the author of 2 published books, one on American labor history, and then one called A Renegade History of the United States, which is what I'm most well known for. And now I'm working on a 3rd book, which will be published by Grove Atlantic, hopefully later this year, which is a history of American foreign policy and the effects of American popular culture, in particular abroad, over the last 150 years. Then, since I left academia about 2 years ago entirely, I have been focused on my podcast, Unregistered, which has been my pride and joy, the most satisfying, fulfilling thing I've ever done. We just had our 100th episode, actually, this last week. And it's in that podcast, I interview many different kinds of people, but the rule is it has to be someone who says things that are somewhat dangerous or not allowed in polite society. So I've had everything from simply academics like me who say the wrong things, to porn stars, to drug dealers, to prostitutes, to anybody who says or does things that are outside the norms.
One can say that you investigate cultural taboos.
Yeah. I investigate them. I'm interested in them. I'm mostly interested in how the violation of certain taboos advances what I see or what I define as freedom, personal liberty. And I don't mean that in an absolute sense. I mean the way that I define it, the way that I think of freedom. I see certain taboos, the breaking of certain taboos as simply enlarging the freedom that I think is important. And then also in the last 2 years, I've been building Renegade University, which is an alternative university that's both online and in person. We have video courses that you can stream, and then we have live events across the country. We've been doing that for 2 years now. And we just launched our new website. Go to renegadeuniversity.com to see more about this. And so I'm a busy guy.
Yes, you are. And we'll get back to the university part
at
the end of the interview.
Cool.
because I want to ask you a few questions
Great.
about that.
Yeah.
But you asked me how I knew about you. But first, interestingly enough, you replied with what you do on the question, who are you?
This is why I hated your question.
Yes.
What I gave you was the American answer, right? Which is my career, my job, my profession, right?
Yes, your resume.
But that's not who I am.
Well, I don't know. All I know is that you have a sort of a thorn in your side against work ethic. And yet, when I ask you who you are...
Right. A man of contradictions. You've already noticed this. Indeed, I do work a lot, don't I? I need to work on that. Or not work on that.
Yes, precisely.
I need to not work on that.
So how did I find you? Well, I was looking around on the internet for, in the American socialist arena, and somehow alongside Dave Rubin's show and your own podcast, and you being a guest on other podcasts, I just found you. And I found you to be incredibly interesting because I grew up in Sweden, which is a socialist utopia. That's at least what we're trained to say.
Social democratic utopia.
Sure.
Okay, good. Let's be precise here.
Yes,
okay.
As a libertarian.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and my parents weren't libertarian. This is just in my constitution, I suppose. And I've always felt kind of like a unicorn. But you grew up here as a socialist and wanted from age 10 to become a socialist.
Oh, from the earliest I can remember. My parents, when I was born, were not just socialists, they were professional socialists, that meaning that they dropped out of normal society and took jobs in heavy industry. Like my stepfather was a truck driver and a steel worker, and my mother was a clerical worker. When they were from basically bourgeois upper middle class families, and they could have done anything, and they dropped out of elite universities to do this work in order to organize the workers for the socialist revolution, of course.
Yes.
Problem is, it didn't work out. There was no revolution, and so after about 10 years of doing that, they went back into mainstream society and got regular jobs. But so for the first, I'd say 13 or 14 years of my life, that's who my parents were primarily. They were primarily interested in socialist politics, and so I was surrounded by that, living also in Berkeley. I don't know if your listeners know about this, but Berkeley is sort of the capital or the hub of the American counterculture, and has been for a long time, and of American radical politics, mostly of the silly sort. So yes, I was born into that church. And
what do you mean when you say church?
It's just like being raised in a church. There's sort of assumptions about the world and what should happen in the world and why it's bad and what is good that are unquestioned. Right? It's like,
what type of assumptions? Give me an example, please.
Capitalism is inherently exploitative and therefore needs to be overthrown so that the workers can reap the fruits of their own labor equitably. There you go.
Isn't that just a fact of life?
That's just a fact if you're born in the church. Yeah. So, I mean, of course, there's, socialism, Marxism. There's very, very thick books. There's a lot of textbooks, a lot of rule books for these things. And it's just like the Bible. And the big questions were never addressed, when I was a kid, and we just sort of assumed all these things. We assumed that anybody to the right of sort of Hillary Clinton was no different essentially than Hitler, and to be dismissed. There's nothing good to be said about anybody to the right of Hillary Clinton of any stripe. And so that was my training, but without my parents being deliberate about it, which was nice, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter. They didn't
brainwash you.
They didn't need to, right? I mean, I was living not only in Berkeley, but I was living with them. Everybody in Berkeley still agrees on every single thing. Everybody in Berkeley basically is on the left, and they were in the hard left. So yeah, I went to college with this in mind. I need to find out what socialism is because I have to be one. I have to be a socialist. And that was actually my mission. So I sat down with the books, started reading Marx and Lenin and all the rest of it. And I did. I figured out what it was. And I read the great texts, many of the great texts in the history of socialism, and learned who the great socialists were. And I became a socialist. I became a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, which I think is Bernie Sanders' organization. Did that.
When was this?
This was in all through the 1980s. When I was in college. And then when I went to graduate school at Columbia in the early 90s, that was still my mission. And that's why I did labor history for my first book, because that's what a good Marxist socialist does. You look at the working class, labor history, because that's all that matters. And I ended up writing, you're going to like this, the only, as far as I know, essentially libertarian history of labor in America, probably anywhere, in which I argued that competition between unions was a good thing for members of the unions, just like competition between producers or businesses is good for the consumers, right? Union members are basically consumers of a service that union leaders.
Because you're not against freedom of assembly, for instance.
No. So no, of course not. Yeah. But so that argument that market mechanism actually produces greater accountability among union members seemed to me to make sense. And I showed it with evidence that it was true for many, many large unions. For labor historians, for people on the left in this country, and it was in the New York Times, it was reviewed in the Washington Post and major publications, they just hated it. Because the idea, of course, is that there'd be one big union that rules the world.
Yes.
The socialist utopia, which is led by the proletariat. The vehicle for that revolution for most socialists is trade unions, and to reduce the number of trade unions and to limit the competition among them. I said that's just the opposite. It's the other way around. The more competition you have, the more those unions are going to do for their members, right? And so that was the first kick I received from the academic establishment. The second kick was when I moved my attention to African-American history in particular, and Martin Luther King, and the history of Black culture, which was going to be my project after the labor history book. And
because you are African-American.
I'm glad you noticed, yes.
Well, I read a bit about your upbringing, and apparently you grew up in partly or almost entirely Black neighborhood.
It was
for a while.
It was mixed. I'd say it was about 2/3 Black, when I was growing up there. And that was part of my childhood, not all of it. But a significant chunk of sort of the middle of my childhood was spent in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And then the schools in Berkeley were forcibly integrated by busing. I was in the first generation of school children in this country to be bused. That was in 1970 in kindergarten.
So you were bused because you're actually Caucasian?
Everybody got bused. I
All
mean,
right.
That's how.
So they bust in everybody from everywhere.
That was how
like
brilliant the leaders of Berkeley, the city of Berkeley, were. They bust everybody to a different school so that they could achieve perfect parity, racial parity in every school. That's actually what they did. So it was a gigantic social engineering project.
And how has it worked out in retrospect?
Well, they made me Black, so it was. I think they did a pretty good job. No, it had nothing to do with that. It was really the neighborhood I was raised in, and it was true, like Oakland, we were on the Oakland border, which is a very, it's a largely African-American city. I did simply just become very enamored with African-American culture, what's called African-American culture, and still am. And that was an early influence, still is. In particular, stand-up comedy. Black stand-up comedians have been among my major influences, like Richard Pryor, Red Fox, Moms Mabley, going back further, Dave Chappelle, you name it. I think that in many ways, they have been the most incisive critics of American culture that we've had in the 20th century and the 21st century.
As a Jewish stand-up comedian, I cannot possibly agree with you.
Jews are second best. I'm a quarter Jewish, so I can say whatever I want, by the way.
All right, cool.
I'm all Black and a quarter Jewish. So I'm basically free of any criticism here.
So then you wrote a book about African-American history.
No, I wrote an article about African-American history in which I showed that Martin Luther King was very puritanical toward Black culture. Didn't like any of it. He didn't even like jazz. He didn't like rock and roll. He didn't like rhythm and blues. He didn't like slang. He didn't like emotional expressions in the Black church. He gave these sermons in which he sounded like a racist, actually. He was so condemnatory of Black culture. And people simply didn't know this, and I found it. You can find it online looking at his sermons from the 1950s. And my colleagues simply didn't believe me because I was challenging the great idol. This is Martin Luther King. He couldn't have said these things about Black people. And I said, well, yes, he did, because his project required it. Not because he was a bad guy, but because assimilation requires that.
Yes.
Our culture, the formal culture of the United States, requires that you speak the King's English, or so-called good American English. Requires that you be a good worker, a good soldier, a good citizen, you follow the laws, you obey authority, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, African-American history, in particular, working class African-American history, is full of people who didn't do those things. Thank God, because if we didn't have them, we would have a much more boring country. A little bit more, I think, like where you're from.
But don't you think that culture is not a zero-sum game? You can have multiple cultures within you.
Sure. I mean, you can say that they're infinite cultures, right? You can find it right here as a culture. We've created a culture. This interview has a culture.
That is one way to do it. But,
sure.
From a group perspective, I mean, you could, for instance, I have Jewish culture, but I also have Swedish culture because I know the language, and language is culture, right?
Sure, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. So, I mean, you can define culture in any way. So I try to be as precise as possible. So I use the term working class African-American culture, which simply means people not only had to work for a living, but people who were not aspiring to be leaders of the society. They were not seeking to become sort of, politicians or generals or to become members of the managerial class of America, right? They just wanted to live their lives, right? Unlike people like Martin Luther King or Barack Obama, right, who clearly have aspirations to become fully a part of the managerial class, the ruling class of the United States, which requires that you wear a business suit. It requires that you obey the Puritan work ethic. It requires that you have a wife and 2 or 3 kids, and that's it. It requires that you show no sexuality whatsoever. It requires that you be a good father if you're a man, or a good wife, and a mother if you're a woman, etc. So that's what King was preaching to African Americans. He said, you have to change. You have to get rid of all this stuff from slavery. That, by the way, gave us blues and gave us jazz and gave us much of American English, really, and much of a sort of a way of being with our bodies, and gave us, great entertainers and great athletes and all the rest of it. He said, get rid of all of that because we got to be like the white man. He actually said explicitly, we must adopt the norms of the dominant culture.
I'm glad you brought up work ethic.
Yeah.
Because you got to decide the time for this interview. And you said 5 o'clock. And then you changed it to 4 o'clock. And then you...
On a Saturday.
Yes, and then you changed it to 4:30. And then you sent a text message via Waze that you would be arriving at exactly 4:09.
Oh, did I?
And then you came, I don't know when you arrived, but you sat in your car until 5. And then you texted me, I'm here.
How do you decipher all of that? What do you make of that?
I have no idea. I'm just.
I don't either.
I'm just asking you because I'm going to ask you a question on work ethic.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
and I know you admire slackers in a way. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's because this was such a strange thing that you would, you'd want to push the interview earlier. Because that indicates that you're eager to go.
Yeah.
And then I say, no, but you booked it for 5.
I honestly thought I'd booked it for 4, and I was driving here from the Bay Area. So here's I think what you're getting at. Why do I work so hard if I don't believe in the work ethic? Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're gonna talk quite a bit about this.
And why am I on time or even early when I praise slackers in my book and elsewhere? Yes. Okay. So there's two attitudes toward work in American history, and I think there's 2 attitudes toward work in general. One is it is a means to an end. Okay, that is just a practical consideration. It's hard to deny that. In the world that we live in this level, in this consciousness that you and I share, like if I want to move this glass from here to here, I have to do a little bit of work with my hand. Okay,
yes.
If you want to own a car, you've got to, in this society, in this culture, you have to do something to make money so that you can buy the car. Okay, that requires work, almost always of some kind. I don't dispute that. It's indisputable. That is very different from viewing work as a good in itself, as virtuous in itself, no matter what you get for it. That is what we call either the Puritan or the Protestant work ethic, which people from Scandinavia know a little bit about, right? So that's what I critique in my work. That's why when I talk about slackers and how I like slackers, it's not people who are homeless and have no nice things because they refuse to work at all. It's people who disobey the Puritan work ethic, who work only to get the good stuff and not 1 minute more. Those are my heroes.
Why?
I simply don't like work. When I say work, what I mean is work that you wouldn't do otherwise, right? That you would
just for money.
Yeah, right. You do it for whatever you get from
because
it.
You love what you do.
Yeah, and also, but I do it for the money too, right?
Yeah, obviously, but
Yeah.
in your case, it seems more as if though you've found a way to monetize your pleasures.
Right. We are among the very, very few who are able to do for money what we like to do, right? So
yes, that is an extremely privileged position.
Extremely, I'd say rare position at least. I don't know if it's privileged, but yeah, it's certainly rare. So yeah, but what I think is terrible is people who shame those who don't work, who shame those who don't think the work is good. I think that's the reason that Americans work more on average than any other people on earth by country.
I think you might be quite
except
right.
I think Hong Kong is the only place that beats us.
Really?
But certainly compared to all the European countries, we work way more.
But the Japanese then?
I think we work more than the Japanese as well, but I might
but
be wrong
they
about
pretend to work more.
that. They just look busy.
Yes. I'll give you a tidbit from the Swedish language,
Okay.
and that is that the word for having a hard time in Swedish is actually derived from the verb to work. So it's like you're going to work. Yeah, it's worky.
Right.
You see? But you don't really have that here, do you?
No, because we think work is good.
Yes.
Yeah.
And also, I'm worried about this attack you're launching against the libertarian idea of importance that we ascribe to the work ethic. Because I think there is something...
I think I'm much more libertarian than you are on this. I think my position on work is the correct libertarian position on work.
I'm sure you think so. And this is the subject that we're going to discuss for the next few minutes.
Let's do it.
Because you want to put the libertine back in libertarian. And I don't mind libertines. I live with at least two here. I was
going to say, look at this, where we're sitting right now, if you can see it. Yeah.
Yes, but I've seen you pull out an iPhone and say something on the lines like, we created this iPhone in order to be more efficient so that we could work less, but instead we work more. And I'd like to pose the question, if the work ethic was what led to the iPhone, which could make us work less, in your opinion, but if we did, we would be as poor as people were before the iPhone, wouldn't we? And the work ethic. And isn't that a contradiction and or paradox?
Well, you're presuming something. First, the whole question is based on the presumption that Steve Jobs invented the iPhone, or whoever it was at Apple, because of the work ethic. I doubt that, first of all.
You think it was the acid?
The acid psychedelics can be very productive, I've heard, especially when you microdose. But even if it were the product of the work ethic, and I think in part it had to be simply because he's an American, it's deeply ingrained in almost all of us.
Yes, I can tell, sitting across from you.
There you go, right? Sure, the Puritan or Protestant work ethic has tremendous benefits. We're overlooking Los Angeles, much of which was built because of that, right? Just all the work that Americans have done, famously, we're famous for how much work we do, right? I mean, the Europeans have made fun of us for 200 years for this, right? You know this, right?
Because they're lazy.
And that's what I've heard, and drink a lot and fornicate. It has certainly built a lot of bridges. It has certainly built a lot of roads and airplanes and bombs and electrical grids and beautiful houses like this one, etc. Sure, of course. When you work a lot, there's things going to be built. That was the point. Is, should we enjoy it? And the Puritans said no. In fact, they said you should not build things, make things, produce things that are enjoyable in those ways, in sensual ways. They should only please God. They should only serve the purpose of building God's community on earth, the city upon a hill, is what they said. If you make money, which they wanted you to do, Puritans, they said, work and make the money, but don't invest it in yourself. Don't glorify yourself. Don't aggrandize yourself. Invest it in the community, God's community. And don't make fancy things, ostentatious things like much of Los Angeles is, right?
Yes.
They would look down on that very much, but they would like maybe the water system and the power grid and some of the buildings here, the plain ones, right? The functional stuff.
You have highways in the sky.
That's right.
I enjoy that immensely.
That's where you end up, yeah. So that, does that help clarify? Is that...
Well, I like what you're saying, and I've watched quite a few lectures with you online. I'm just worried that if we apply your theory full out, that we won't see the next iPhone.
Because people will stop working when they find out that work is not godly?
Yes.
I don't get it. I mean, people are motivated. First of all, this work ethic thing that Americans have, pretty much we're the only ones who have it, right?
Yes.
It's not in Europe, we know, because you're a bunch of lazy slackers. Look at the number of hours worked in Europe.
We have 5 to 6 weeks paid vacation every year.
It's like hundreds of hours more we work on average per year. It's for every European country compared to every... Okay, and simply, you know this, there's the idea of work being godly in itself is not a thing in Europe or much of the world. It's really only here, as far as I know. So, I mean, I think there's been quite a bit of productivity outside the United States, number one. I think, your people have produced quite a lot of stuff, without...
IKEA.
Yep, there you go.
But you have to assemble the furniture yourself.
But your cars come fully assembled. We like those.
Yeah.
So that's number one, right? And in fact, productivity per work hour is higher in Europe than it is here. So, I mean, there's no reason we can't have lots of good stuff. You guys live just as well as we do, right? And you work a lot less. Okay.
Well, we have less stuff, I think. Or,
Not much less, though.
What Klein called the tyranny of choice is not as tyrannical in my country as it is here.
Okay, you may have fewer choices, but I think your quality of living materially is about the same, right?
Sweden would definitely qualify,
Yeah,
yes.
I think most European countries do.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in France just not long ago. I was in Greece just before that, and they looked pretty much like America in terms of how people lived.
What parts of Greece were you in?
I did not see any evidence of the economic crisis. I was there a year and a half ago. I did not see. I'm sure it's there, but I was in Athens. I was all across the Peloponnese, and then I was in the islands, and I never saw anything that looked like an economic crisis going on.
You didn't see the refugees wallowing up on shore? You didn't?
No.
I was in Kos just a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And I was standing in the water looking at refugees coming my way. They were just wading past me upwards.
I'm sure. I meant more the economic crisis in Greece. It did not look like a poor country or country that was in crisis. That's all I know. I know the refugees are coming in for sure.
I think of Greece kind of like if the EU is like the United States in any way, shape, or form, Greece is our Arkansas.
Right.
It's never going to do great numbers, but we're going to have to pay for them anyway.
Sure, but Arkansas, compared to most of the rest of the world, is a wealthy man's paradise.
That is true. That is true.
As is Greece.
And you talk a little bit about the 3-day weekend and where it comes from.
2-day weekend.
I
wish we had 3 days.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was listening to your lecture just before you came in here about why we have a two-day weekend. Right. Can you please explain to my listeners?
Yeah, I mean, it's my argument. Yes, there's quite a bit of evidence to support it. So we know from employers' records, employers' complaints, employers' even lawsuits, but we have from their own written notes, their diaries from the 19th century in the United States and the first factories that were built here. We know from that employees who were first working in these factories for, usually 12, 14, 16 hours a day weren't accustomed to it and tended not to be very efficient, not very industrious, and most of all, they had a hard time obeying the clock.
Why is that?
It was brand new to them because they had just come from the fields. They were basically the American version of peasants. They had come from family farms, usually in New England or upstate New York or somewhere in the South, into the city where there was a factory. Right? Or into some town where there was a factory. And before then, when you're on a farm, you don't have a clock. You have the roosters and you have nature, you have sun rising and setting. That sets the rhythm of the day. Suddenly it was a mechanical device regimenting the day and regimenting you and making essentially you into a machine. And ever since then, all of us have been working and living according to that damn thing.
Because productive society needed that we invented time.
It certainly, it has been believed, and I can't deny this, that it makes people more efficient. Right, and it makes society more efficient, of course, right? But there's also a price to pay, isn't there, right? I mean, so it's not that I'm opposed to work. I'm not opposed to efficiency. It's just that we need to always be cognizant, I think, of the price that we pay for that. And often Americans just push that aside and say, just keep working, make yourself more efficient, make yourself into a machine, and then I guess you're going to go to heaven.
Yes.
Or something, but sometimes they don't even get that far. They just say, keep making yourself more efficient, push harder. And you'll see that in our sports culture a lot, right? And I think a lot of kids get this from sports culture. The harder you work as an athlete, the more the commentators will praise you. That's what they praise first, more than athletic ability often or innovation. If it's the hardworking athlete on the team they really love, right?
Yes, work ethic.
Yeah, same thing, right? Regardless of what you get for it, is what I'm saying. That's the stuff I don't like. That's why I think we work a lot and don't enjoy the fruits of our labor nearly as much as we could.
In essence, you prefer a football player with pure talent who never goes to practice but scores a shitload of goals.
I admire both.
All right.
I'm just saying that American culture skews heavily, the formal culture, the top tier culture, skews heavily toward favoring the guy who works hard over the guy who's very talented.
Because it was very interesting. You've gone through evidence from the middle management were the ones that really discovered that they couldn't get people to work.
Right.
Why is that? Can you describe a typical work week back in the day here in the United States?
Yeah, so in the 19th century, you mean, when it started? Yeah, so as I said, they were typically 12, 14, or 16-hour work days, usually about 6 days a week. So it was, 60 to 80 hours, something like that on average, which is an incredible amount. In a factory, usually in a mill.
But they weren't terribly efficient.
No, I mean, because they'd never worked the machines before, nor had the managers managed a company before.
And they didn't have armbands with clocks on them.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, and so, but also they showed up late because they weren't used to waking up with a clock, and they took long lunches, and they left sometimes early because, again, same thing. it was the regimentation of human beings that was being resisted at that time. Right?
And these are the slackers, as you call them.
Yeah. And they actually, many of them were women. So many of the first textile factories in this country were staffed primarily by women. So it was young women who were doing this. And then it was immigrants after that who did the same thing, because they were coming from truly peasant cultures, often in Southern and Eastern Europe. And they would get here and they'd be in some big giant box with a giant machine in front of them, and they were told to turn and screw the same way for 12 hours a day. And as you might imagine, there was a lot of resistance to that. You know? A lot of drinking on the job that was expected. And so that's when...
Expected?
Sure. Yeah, there was so much drinking. It was so common that in early 19th century, at least, employers were expected to provide grog and beer and rum to the workers.
Awesome.
Right.
Yes.
We got to get back to that. or introduce weed, one or the other.
Yeah, well, you have come a long way then, I suppose.
Indeed.
And the managers tried to get these people to work, but they noticed that the efficiency went down towards Friday and didn't pick up until Tuesday or something like that.
Right. Again, this is the early 19th century, so before the Civil War. But yes, we have a lot of records from employers complaining about how the drinking would sort of ramp up, increase through the week, and so by Friday they were just so. What is it? Snack? What do you guys? What's drunk and what do you guys say in Sweden?
Flat out drunk.
Flat out drunk is the Swedish term. Okay, They were so flat out drunk they couldn't work, and so employers essentially gave up on trying to make them work on the weekends, and then. On Mondays, it has been said by many, including Ben Franklin, that they would drink even more over the weekend. So the Monday they were hungover again. So they got essentially a 3-day weekend. You were right when you originally misspoke, actually. And they called that, you know this better than I do. What's it called? Saint Monday, or they had a name for it. It was Saint something Monday. It became a name, sort of an informal holiday among employers and employees. In early America, that all began to change after the Civil War, and the immigrants come in, and then there's an assimilation campaign, a massive assimilation campaign of the immigrants trying to make them fit into this capitalist industrial advanced culture.
But also from all the evidence collected from these middle managers that they couldn't make these people work, they would work themselves to death if they tried. That is where the 2-day weekend comes from. They just realized if we are to keep up productivity, then we have to give them 2 days off.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's right. Right. So employers started to just voluntarily reduce the work day and the work week because of this, because they couldn't make these people work 12 to 16 hours a day doing the same repetitive motion over and over again. So employers largely voluntarily reduced the work day and work week. Then trade unions come in and they see this. And they're also, by the way, very imbued with the Protestant work ethic as well. They're part of American culture and they want their workers to work hard. And they want workers to honor work as virtuous. And they saw that forcing them into these factories and working in these terrible conditions actually made workers veer away from the Protestant work ethic and become more debauched and degraded and less attached to work. And so trade unions and employers and the government essentially came together at the end of the 19th century and said, okay, to fix this problem of widespread slacking and most of all, this flouting of the Protestant work ethic that this country was founded upon, we will put laws in place, regulations in place, reducing the workday and work week. So trade unions and the government have gotten credit for the weekend when in fact it was drunks and slackers.
Who forced them?
Who forced them to do it, precisely.
Right. So, and that is why you think slacking off is actually kind of a freedom fighter thing to do.
In that case, yeah, I think they should be on our coins and dollar bills, those people.
And I can't tell you how to run your currency. So if you ever get the chance to head up the National Reserve, I suppose, or the Treasury?
Treasury, I think, does that, yeah.
Yes. And this, of course, in my mind, must have to do something with our biology as well. We can't work 7 days a week. It's not healthy, even though that's probably the natural state. But in the natural state, we didn't live that long anyway.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Because you also say that shaming sex workers for selling their bodies is irrational, since we all sell our bodies in one way or another. But regardless of whether it is irrational or not, since humans aren't very rational creatures, don't you have to admit that this differentiation between selling your body as a football player and selling your body as a prostitute exists?
First of all, I don't think I say that it's irrational.
No, I said it was irrational.
Oh.
I mean, Because it is, because for instance, you're selling your body now, right? Because you're promoting yourself and something that
I
doing.
brought my body here. I'm sitting my body down. I'm using my mouth. I'm using my eyes. Yep. Okay.
So that's one way of selling your body.
Right.
So and the football player might be selling his body, or a soldier is definitely selling his body in the most dangerous way.
Unless he's conscripted, unless he's drafted.
Yes.
Yes. Right. If he's volunteering. Yep.
Yeah. And so is a prostitute. So rationally, if you look at it, there should be really no difference.
That is my argument.
Yes, I think that is your.
Yes. Okay.
Am I incorrect?
No, that's correct. Yes.
Yes.
Exactly.
But for humans, there exists a difference in every culture, in every time, I think.
On this question, you mean?
Between prostitution as selling your body and all the other forms of selling your body.
Of course, yes. I mean, this culture, many cultures, most cultures have drawn a line between that kind of work and all other kinds of work.
Yes.
Right, which is what has put women on the streets, under overpasses, under bridges, in danger, put them under the control of pimps and criminals and all the rest of it. I think it's done terrible damage to many, many, many people over 2 centuries in this country. For no good reason. In other words, so sex workers say, who are part of the sex worker activist movement here, rights movement, is that sex work is work. Prostitution is work. It's selling your body just like you and I are selling our bodies right now.
Yes, but humans always seem to make that distinction between sex work and other types of work. I mean, that is not only true for Christians. It's true in Japan, where you have a geisha if you want to have fun at night, and then you have your wife at home. Or in the Middle East back in the day, they had concubines and wives. And I thought that has to do with reproduction and controlling reproduction, where your legitimate children comes from, the ones that are supposed to inherit the fruits of your labor, and your bastards. Yes.
Each culture is different on this, right? And so some cultures are very lenient toward prostitution. Go to Thailand, go to Bangkok, you'll see, right? A very huge difference between there and here. And much of Asia is like that. Much of even Europe, Germany is very different, right? Amsterdam is famously different than we are. And
yes. We have a very interesting law.
And in Sweden, of course, the Swedish model is not my favorite. And a lot of...
You know what we have done?
Yes. You've criminalized the procuring of prostitution rather than the selling of it.
Yes. So what do you think about that? Please tell me.
I am against that.
Why?
Absolutely. Why should any of it be criminalized? Why should any of it be illegal?
Because men come from the patriarchy and women do not.
I see. Right. That is yes. That is the argument that's made by what are called prohibitionists, people who want to continue to prohibit prostitution or sex work. Usually, that's the feminist argument against it.
Yes.
Right. It replicates patriarchal relations between men and women.
They don't seem to have a problem with men selling their bodies for sex.
No, there's a bit of a double standard there, I would say.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's probably because we're better at it.
So I'm not sure we agree then.
We're not seeking consensus here. God's sake.
I was just checking.
Because
the line of your questioning, I just wasn't sure if you were like trying to get, in a Socratic way, get me to show a contradiction or to show a difference between us.
I always try to sort of expose contradictions, but I also want you to be at your best, and I think you can handle it.
Of course I can. That's why I'm here.
Because I liked your idea that the suffragettes, and this is not your words, these are my words, so that the listener won't think that I'm just saying what you think. It's that basically the suffragettes killed feminism in a way.
How so?
Well, your idea is that the first free women who could work and make money and attain power were actually prostitutes.
Right. In the book, I show that in the 19th century again, but all the way to the 1920s, prostitutes, so-called prostitutes in this country, were by far the best paid. They were the wealthiest women in this country. They were basically the only women who owned significant property, usually real estate, not just brothels, but they used the proceeds from their businesses, their brothels, to buy serious real estate, especially in the West. Denver, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, those cities were in large part built by prostitutes and madams, the owners of brothels. Prostitutes in the 19th century enjoyed all kinds of freedoms, or I should say they practiced all sorts of freedoms that were taboo at the time that we now take for granted, like wearing makeup, like coloring your hair, like wearing brightly colored clothes, like showing skin, like dancing in public, like smoking in public. Of course, being sexual in public, right, was a part of it, which was totally taboo in the Victorian era. Prostitutes just flouted all those rules and did what they wanted, and lo and behold, by the 20th century, virtually every American woman had adopted their style, their culture, and these new ways of being that were formerly taboo and now we take for granted.
So makeup really comes from the sex industry.
It really does, yeah. I mean, Kathy Pice is a great historian from the University of Pennsylvania who's written an entire book about this. It's called Hope in a Jar, and it's the history of the cosmetics industry, and she shows that it's been largely built on sex work.
That is so fascinating, and I think most women in Sweden today would find it very insulting.
Troubling.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's indisputable. The sort of famous flapper hairstyle of the 1920s, the short bobbed hairstyle, which was the rage here and in Europe.
And also my fiancée has that hairstyle today.
Well,
so.
don't let her listen to this. So that is well known to have been pioneered by prostitutes in brothels in New Orleans. We have photographic evidence of prostitutes in the 1900s, well before the flappers came along, with that hairstyle. So the flappers took it, then it became very stylish in the 1920s. By the 1930s, the first ladies of the United States, the president's wives, have those hairstyles. So Eleanor Roosevelt's formal portrait in the White House is her wearing a flapper / prostitute hairstyle.
Oh, I've always loved Eleanor Roosevelt.
Not me, except for that.
Well, mainly for the quote that she's, there's a quote ascribed to her that small minds discuss people, average minds discuss events, and great minds discuss ideas.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, it's a good quote.
She's all right for a mass murderer.
Who did she murder?
Oh, I mean, she was she was essentially part of the Roosevelt administration, which in my view murdered millions of people.
Where?
Across much of the world. It's a thing called World War II.
You mean in a grand politician sort of way?
Yeah, like calling for the bombing of cities with civilians in them. And
well, so did Obama.
this is right.
Yes.
This is correct. He just did it on a smaller scale.
And it's sort of a prerequisite if you're the president of the United States. You're going to have to, some point in time.
Sure. It's just that the Roosevelts did more killing than I think any other president in history, which is saying something.
Really?
I think their body count's number one. Yeah. For sure. Yeah, if you look at the Germans and the Japanese who were killed. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, Truman's probably a close second, but we're talking many millions of people needlessly killed by those people. So.
Well, were they needlessly killed?
Indeed, I think.
The Germans and the Japanese?
In my view, yeah. That's
during a certain point in time?
Yeah, in my view, yes.
We're talking like late 30s, middle 40s here?
Correct.
Yes?
Yeah. So if you want to do this now, this is the book I'm working on now.
Let's go.
Okay. Okay, so there's the Pacific War, right? Mm-hmm. I'm talking about U.S. involvement. So there's the Pacific War, and then, of course, there's U.S. involvement in Europe and North Africa. So the Pacific War, and I'd say this is a majority opinion among historians, a solid majority, close to a consensus opinion, is that, so it's not just me and my radical thinking, that Roosevelt forced the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor through essentially economic exploitation and blackmail. I mean, he cut off their supplies. It's an island with no natural resources. 90% of their steel and iron was coming from the United States. He cut all that off. So they were forced to move outward into these islands in the Pacific where they had those natural resources. And Roosevelt and the administration knew that, and they deliberately did it. There was no
get into the war.
There was no reason.
But if he hadn't, put a limit or curbed their steel production, they would have just continued to kill people in China, wouldn't they?
So they certainly had invaded Manchuria.
So what do you have against the Chinese?
Yeah. So the Japanese were not a nice empire at all. They were a murderous, mass raping empire. Not the people, but the empire, the government. And yes, certainly in China and also in Southeast Asia, they did plenty of pillaging and raping and killing. This is true.
These are not easy questions.
No. But what I'm giving you is pretty much all close to a consensus view of this among historians. So again, this is not even just me. This is most historians. Their ambitions never went beyond that, though. The Japanese empire, they wanted to avoid any confrontation with the United States. They wanted to trade with the United States because that's where they got most of their stuff from. So they did everything they could to avoid confrontation with the United States. It was the last thing they wanted. They did, in fact, want to take control of a certain portion of Asia, including northern China, Manchuria, for the natural resources there. Not a nice thing or not a great thing.
No.
But there was no reason to kill tens of millions of people for it, nor was there a reason to firebomb all of their cities.
Yes, well, they killed tens of thousands of people for it. Or Chinese, if you consider them to be people.
Indeed, but so that was a regional war, right, going on, that we made into a world war by entering it.
Well, you can also choose who to do business with.
Sure.
I come from Sweden, so I know a bit about this.
Yeah, right. And then the European war side. This is the more controversial, obviously, argument I make. Although it is becoming, I'd say, close to a majority opinion. Yeah, I think this is true among German and British historians. American historians are the last to find out about things, but that Hitler's ambitions were similar. That he only wanted Eastern Europe. He only wanted Russia and Poland. And he never had any interest in keeping Western Europe. He had no interest at all in attacking the United States. He wanted, again, also to be partners with the U.S. So the last thing he wanted was the U.S. and the Allies to attack him. He simply wanted Lebensraum in the East, in Poland and Western Russia.
Which is bad enough, I think.
Sure, and that involved killing lots of Poles, and also, but also the Nazi policy vis-a-vis Jews until the day after Pearl Harbor. It's very important. From 1933, when they take power, all the way to the fall of 1941, the official policy of the Nazi Party toward Jews was to move them out, migrate them out of Germany, first to Palestine, and then when that was stopped by the British, then to Madagascar, and that was stopped by the Allies refusing, all of them, including the United States, to take Jewish refugees, any of them, and by starting the war, by invading against Hitler, so he no longer could do that. So that, I argue that U.S. intervention in the war against Germany didn't cause the Holocaust, but it necessitated it.
There are aspects of this that I can actually agree with, but you have to understand, first of all, the British were on the side of the Arabs that were in the Palestinian Protectorate at the time.
That's why they started.
And the Arabs really didn't want Jews there.
Sure.
You've heard of Ajhamin al-Husseini.
This is why, yeah, I know. This is why Churchill started shooting and bombing the ships carrying Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany to Palestine.
Yeah.
Yes, because of this. Very few people know this, but there are books written about it by credentialed historians that the Nazi regime with international Zionist organizations formed an alliance to move German Jews and Austrian Jews to Palestine. They co-established the state of Israel.
Well, okay. So
many original Israelis were moved there by the Nazi regime. This is a fact.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is a fact.
Yeah.
But also, since he couldn't move them there anymore, when you deprive people of the means to support themselves and you move them into ghettos, you've already started a Holocaust. Because if people can't support themselves, they can't get food, and and also what Hitler wanted to do was not only he wanted all of Germania. So he wanted all the Germanic tribes and Lebensraum in the east.
Right.
But he wanted the entire Germania, which includes all of Scandinavia, by the way.
I have not seen evidence for that, frankly.
Well, I live there.
Well,
I'm Jewish.
Okay, therefore you know history.
No, but I've also written a 461-page book about it.
Okay.
And I'll show you the English translation when I'm done by the end of January.
You believe that Hitler wanted to invade, occupy, and keep permanently in his possession?
Not necessarily.
All of Scandinavia?
No.
Not part of it?
Well, what he wanted was a sort of Aryan mini EU. Judenfrei EU, with some Lebensraum in the east. That's what I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Again, the countries, the Germanic countries he occupied was basically to fulfill this vision.
Okay. I mean, I will just say that most historians disagree with you on this.
Well, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. But we all agree that he had murderous intentions, certainly vis-a-vis the Poles and the Russians. No doubt about it. What's interesting is, and this is the thing that sort of blew me away when I did the research, I didn't know this myself, is that Hitler drew a very sharp distinction early in his career when he first joined the Nazi Party between two kinds of anti-Semites. One kind he called the anti-Semites of emotion. Those were the Russians who would go on pogroms, these sporadic, spontaneous lynchings of Jews in the streets, right? They were not planned, they weren't organized, they weren't efficient, most importantly. He didn't like that, and he didn't like Russians either. He thought they were inferior to him, stupid. They were the stupid anti-Semites. They were ruled by emotions. He called himself and the Nazis the anti-Semites of reason.
Yes.
And he said, instead of just killing these people, you got to line them up and march them out, and you have to find a place to put them. It was not actually a lethal policy until 1941. It was, you could say it was partly lethal.
I would say it's definitely lethal from 1935.
Well, there's a tiny, tiny number of Jews who were killed in that period from 35 to 41, until the summer of 41, until the invasion of Russia.
Well, 1938, Kristallnacht.
I mean, I'm talking about, yeah, I know, but even that night, there was compared to the murders
Of the Holocaust, yes.
Yeah,
but that
it's a
was German
very
efficiency at its finest. And partly because of the Kristallnacht, because in the Kristallnacht, what happened was that the Germans descended into the into the barbaric traditions of Russians and Poles.
And Hitler and much of the Nazi leadership did not like Kristallnacht and disciplined many of the officers for it.
Yes, nor did most of Europe. When I've read the Swedish newspaper articles at the time, they're not shocked that people are killing Jews, but they're shocked that it's
anarchic. Anarchic is what they didn't like. Anarchic, like
anarchy. Yeah, but that it was. It wasn't efficient, and it wasn't for a culture welfare nation like Germany at the time. It was considered beneath them.
We have sufficient evidence, I think, that Hitler and Goering and other top Nazi leaders were appalled by Kristallnacht, not because Jews were hurt, but because it made it more difficult to get them out of the country fast. That's all they wanted. They just wanted to get rid of them fast.
Yep.
And that was not the way to do it, because all of a sudden all the world is against them, and then Hitler and the people are closing off the shipping lanes to get them out, and etc. The Allies, the United States, again, I'm going to state this again because people don't know this, the Allies, all of them, including the United States, did not admit any significant number of Jewish refugees from 1933 till 1945. Okay, one of the great humanitarian crimes of all time, in my view. And so just that alone, I mean, gives much of the blame to the Roosevelt administration right there and the United States.
Thank you so much. We weren't supposed to talk about this at all, but it's quite interesting. And this is in your next book?
Correct.
I have to send you the script of my book when I have an English translation. I have a first draft, but I don't think it's good enough for you, sir. Sure.
Okay.
Sure. I'm sorry. I used sir. It should have been sure. Okay. We were actually on prostitution.
Of all things, yeah.
And you already knew about our legal system to sell sex. So that's pretty impressive in itself that you know so much about that. And so I have a final question on your book, Renegade History of the United States, which is, are you saying that we should all bring in, there's one more question I want to ask you because we've done slackers now, and we've done the prostitutes, but I want to talk briefly about the gangsters.
Yeah.
Yes, because you think they have contributed to our great civilization as well. Mm-hmm. Yes, can you please tell my listener how?
Sure. So, well, in many ways, in this country, the mafia, so-called mafia, and that's both the Sicilian mafia and the Jewish mafia.
Yay.
Yep, there you go. Mostly in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, did a lot of things that we would consider to be progressive now, as a matter of fact. So the first thing, most obvious thing, is during Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal in this country in the 1920s, who sold most of the alcohol, right? It was, we know this, the gangsters, right? And so without them simply supplying this forbidden product, we may never have ended Prohibition. We could still have, we could still look a lot like a Christian colony. Right?
So the reason we can have a drink in a bar today in America,
in large part,
is because of gangsters.
In large
because
part.
we had prohibition for a while in Sweden as well. Mm-hmm. It's a Protestant country, as you may know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In large part, yes, I give them a lot of credit for that. They also created speakeasies, which were these underground bars here that were illegal. And those are the first public bars where women were allowed, where gays were allowed, where blacks and whites were allowed together, where immigrants came in. Because, these were gangsters, so they didn't care about social norms anyway. And they just saw a buck when they looked at a woman who wanted to come into a bar.
Isn't that beautiful in a way?
It is the most beautiful thing.
I don't know.
That is that is kind of that is the essence of my argument in the book right there, distilled, right? That's it. It's that scene. If you think about a speakeasy in the 1920s selling illegal alcohol to women who were not allowed in public elsewhere, in public bars, are not allowed to dance, and you see racial integration in these spaces that are owned by criminals, and you don't see that anywhere else, right?
Because practically illegal everywhere.
That's right. And again, these Sicilian, they're immigrants. They don't care. They don't even know about the color line here, and they don't care about it. They just want to make money, as I said. And they're criminals. So again, social norms are out the window, and whoever wants to pay can come on in, right?
Well, that's the invitation of America for someone who doesn't have the internet back in the day, and there's this place where you can be free and make money.
But what I'm saying is that gangsters were the ones who fulfilled that promise of America first. they actually offered real freedom, real free spaces where you could actually commingle and trade regardless of social norms.
Now, I agree with you that we should celebrate whores, slackers, and gangsters more.
Okay.
But there is something I'm worried about in your argument, and that is because you're basically arguing for a more tolerant society, right? You want us to not shame people for being miscreants or slackers or whores or gangsters.
I guess so. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my worry is that when you bring them into a normal society, they become utterly boring.
Well, yeah. I mean, on this we agree. So one of the question I think I get every single time I give a talk on my book, and this is now, God knows, more than 100 times. I've got, maybe 200 times. The question I get every time is, who are the renegades today? And almost I have to think. It's hard to think.
Well, I live in a country that has tried to practice democratic socialism now for 100 years. And so I live in a country, and I'm a comedian. I'm supposed to be anti or at least amoral, right? That's my function.
Yeah.
I am a trickster.
That's right.
But I live in a country where they've done away with all the norms, and there's slackers, and they never produce anything, and there's
Really?
and they're boring, and they still try to to be the same person, each and every one. It's basically, I live in the Borg idea of a society. Do you understand? Assimilate,
I do.
and just and have sex, and so
Right.
Sweden is falling apart at the moment. And I find myself in a position where I have to go up on stage and be a moralist. Do you understand? Because I'm a contrarian. I'm a contrarian at heart.
Well, don't do that anymore. Come here and be an amoralist.
Well, maybe I'm more needed more here than I suppose.
I think so. You don't want to be. You can't be a comedian and a moralist.
No, well, I thought it was impossible.
But wait a second. You're saying the problem is that they become too boring? That's the problem with Swedes?
Well, Swedes, I don't know. Maybe they've always been boring. But what I say is, most of the things that make subcultures interesting is that they are absolutely forbidden, shameful. It's sin.
Gotcha.
If you take away shame from anal sex, then what the fuck is the point?
What's the point of anal sex?
It doesn't feel dirty. It doesn't feel sexy.
I see. Right.
You're just trying to wash all the dirt away. And I work with dirt.
So interestingly, I like the theory. So basically, porn is making sex boring. Right?
Well,
right?
Yes.
Because it's taking the taboo away because everyone can see anal sex at any minute.
Yes, and the Catholic Church, they might have had many flaws and tortured a lot of people, but you can't accuse them of not making sex sexy. It's super sexy because it's super forbidden.
They made Christ sexy. They
Well,
made
yes.
Christianity sexy. That's a real trick.
Yes, based on a Jew, that is tricky.
Indeed.
So, do you think that the internal struggle within humanity is between the individual and the collective?
Yeah, that's what I say. I mean, that's what I say is what my work is about. That's what I'm most interested in. If you're gonna generalize at the highest level of abstraction, yeah, that's what I'm about. That's what I'm interested in anyway. Is that struggle, which goes on not just between the individual, you, and society, but I think it usually goes on within us individually. So when the alarm clock goes off next to my bed, like this morning, it's a struggle between me, the individual who wants to stay in bed, and me, the social individual who knows I need to get out of bed because I have an interview in LA, right, to do work with, right? So that goes on all the time with us.
And that's when you need self-mastery, as libertarian usually touts.
What do I need? What is it called?
Self-mastery,
Oh, self-mastery,
self-regulation.
yeah. Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, the self-regulating individual is what we call it in political science over here, which is the core of classical liberalism, which is sort of one variant of libertarianism, right? At the heart of that, according to John Locke and Adam Smith, especially John Locke, is this moralistic, self-regulating, ascetic, puritanical person, right? Because he thought, with good reason, that to operate efficiently and productively and successfully in a market economy where everyone's competing against each other, you simply can't drink, and you got to go to bed on time, and you got to work hard all the time, et cetera, et cetera. So Locke's work is full of moralism against even dancing. He wrote a whole essay about dancing and how it's dangerous and shouldn't be taught to children. Now, that's at the core of a wing of libertarianism that I'm not so fond of, as you might imagine, right? That's the classical liberalism. And I think the classical liberals, I agree with them often, almost always on economic policy and usually on sort of public policy generally. But they tend to be very boring. They tend to be in the suits and the ties, and they tend to be religious, and they tend to not have much fun, and they tend to look down on people who are being free.
Yes, using their freedom.
Yeah.
Enjoying it.
Who are immoral or amoral according to their own sort of preconceived notions. But like, for instance, I'll say his name. There's a very famous libertarian in this country named Tom Woods, he's a friend of mine. He has a great show. I recommend it highly. I've learned much from Tom Woods and his show. I've been on his show a few times. Great guy. But he's one of these classical liberals who is also deeply conservative about cultural values and issues in this way, I think for this reason. And so when I was on his show, he asked me who I would interview on my podcast, and I mentioned sex workers, and he blanched. I mean, and he later said that it was the most shocking thing anyone had ever said on his show.
Why?
And all I did was mention that I have interviewed.
I mean, you said you were going to interview them, not pay them for sex.
Thank you. And that's all I taught. I just said I've had sex workers on my show, and oh my gosh. So, I'm sure would vote to legalize sex work, whereas I think he would, or should if he's a true libertarian, but he ignores the issue entirely. So he's never had a sex worker on his show, and he's had like 2,000 episodes. Now that seems to me, this is a trade that is made illegal by the state. I mean, any libertarian should be championing, right, the legalization of sex work if you're a true libertarian, it seems to me. So to not mention it at all, and you're a libertarian in this country, it seems to me that you've got a problem, reconciling your ideology with some feelings that you have deep inside.
I'm absolutely pro-freedom. I've always been, but I've always also found it kind of strange that there is a paradox built into the concept of freedom, where you get absolute freedom, you also have to take absolute responsibility, because no one else will do it for you.
It depends on what you want and what you're going for, what the objective is. Right? If you want a well-managed society, if you want an efficient society, then you're going to have to check your freedom in all sorts of ways. If you're interested in maximizing whatever it is you want in your own life, there are multiple strategies that can be employed, possibly infinite strategies, right? But what I say is just leave the morality out of it. You decide what you value, what you want, and then let's figure out how to get it. Now, if your strategy to get what you want conflicts with me, or it forces me to do things that I don't want to do, or impinges on my freedom in some way or another, then you and I will have a fight, we'll have a struggle, and the resolution of that will determine who gets the thing.
Yes.
Right? But to me, that's how society should basically operate. Instead of having an overseer, managing us and deciding and resolving our conflict for us, I think we should do it ourselves. And hopefully there won't be a conflict.
Hopefully
maybe there won't be, right?
Yes.
Maybe our interests will coincide, and then we'll ally ourselves and we'll work together to achieve this thing, using work only as a means, not as a good in itself.
That would be good, I think, at least if you have any other job than mine. Mine is quite pleasurable.
Mine too. It just still requires a lot of work, but yeah.
No, it requires a lot of work, but I don't seem to mind doing it most of the time,
Right.
except for the receipts part.
Me too. Exactly. Me
Yeah.
too.
Fuck
Yeah.
that
How'd you
shit.
know? Exactly.
But I find it interesting because the Swedish national ideal that they strive for is not freedom, it's safety, right?
Is that stated? Is that explicit?
Yeah, well, we use the word trygghet. You don't really have it. It's like a combination between comfort and safety.
Oh, yeah.
But what it means in essence is that they want you to give all your personal responsibility to the state in exchange for safety.
Wow.
And as someone here once said, if you give up your freedom for safety, you will eventually end up with neither safety or freedom.
Right.
Yes, I think it was Ben Franklin.
Certainly could have been. Although he's not someone to trust, though. But yes.
No. Well,
But that's wise. Yes, I agree with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
That's interesting. It's fascinating that it's sort of explicit in Swedish culture, right?
Well-
that the value they explicitly value safety and what's the other thing?
No,
Security.
Security, yes.
And they don't even, and freedom is not even a part of the mix, or it's not part of the rhetoric.
We
or
don't
the
talk a
discourse.
lot
Yeah.
about freedom.
You know what else is happening? I've noticed in the United States of America, the discourse of freedom has been declining as well. I don't know. It seems to me that people don't talk about. They don't use the word.
Why?
Politicians, not less and less. It seems like politicians on the left and the right, both Democrats and Republicans, I just have heard freedom and liberty used less and less over the last
That's quite worrisome.
2 or 3 decades. I think I'm right. I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, but I'm pretty sure it's not talked about.
And are they talking more about safety and security?
They're talking about hurt feelings and identities mostly.
Oh, yes. I was going to ask you one last question, so finally we get to it. You've started your own online university, speaking about diversity. And why did you?
Why did I start the university?
Yes.
Because universities and I in this country don't get along, and we haven't for a couple decades now. And we're both. But it became very clear to both of us that we needed to dissolve that marriage.
All of the universities in the United States and you.
Pretty much, yeah. If you know anything about the academic world in the United States, you will know that there is almost 100% uniformity of general opinion on major political questions in the humanities and the social sciences. The sciences, hard sciences, are a bit different, but where I come from, the humanities and social sciences, especially the humanities, which is where history and English are, and philosophy. There's just...
Because you're quite an interesting thinker, and you've published several interesting books that hasn't really been reviewed by academia.
Been ignored.
Yes,
yeah.
And in the cases they haven't not been ignored, they have been labeled as dangerous, irresponsible, and what was this... Improper,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, the second one, Renegade History of the United States, was ignored by academic reviewers. The first book was reviewed, but negatively, mostly, yes. But mostly, I'd say overall, they've ignored me. They just let me do my own thing. Because they don't need to dress me.
You taught at Barnard, right?
Yes, for 6 years, yes.
And you wanted tenure?
Yep.
But they denied it to you?
Correct.
Because of your improperness, dangerousness, and yes.
I was told that. I was also told later that it was also because I was a white man. So there's multiple reasons.
They don't see the black person I'm sitting across from, but
I didn't understand it. I just said to them.
But isn't that against your civil rights?
It's an absolute clear-cut violation of the Civil Rights Act.
How so? Can you explain to the Swedish listener, but just briefly, what
discriminating against someone in employment because of their race or gender is illegal according to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is considered to be sort of the pinnacle and the great achievement of the civil rights movement. We mentioned Martin Luther King earlier. Civil Rights Act was basically the capstone of the civil rights movement, right? And made that illegal. Discriminating against someone in housing or employment because of their race or gender or their religion or their political preferences is illegal in this country. And it is practiced. That act is violated every single day in virtually every single college and university in this country in various ways.
But how can they get away with it? How can they keep acting this way with impunity?
They don't. First of all, they get sued on a regular basis, but we don't know about this. I did find out because I've had friends in administrations at these schools I've worked at that most colleges with the means, which is most of them, have a special fund set aside just to settle lawsuits with faculty and students who have been discriminated against because of their race or gender. So that's one way they get it. That's one way they get away with it. The other is that it is considered to be virtuous to have a diverse student body and a faculty. In fact, that's all it seems to me they care about often. That is the number one priority in universities is diversity, diversity, diversity. And this is just a plain fact, especially over the last 10 to 20 years. I've seen that. And they will sacrifice just about anything to get diversity, include any intellectual quality, any intellectual diversity. It really doesn't matter. I've seen it again and again and again. I can give your listeners one example. This is the most recent job I applied for. It was a school I had been teaching at for years, Occidental College. I'd been teaching there for 5 years. There was another guy who had been teaching there for 9 years. A tenure track position came open in modern American history. That's what we both taught, okay? He had a book, well-reviewed book by a university press. I had 2 books at the time. We both had sterling teaching credentials. We had both been there for many, many years, teaching diligently. We were not even given an interview. We weren't even considered for the position. All 4 of the finalists, there were 600 people who applied for this job. All 4 of them, none of the 4 had a PhD. They were all graduate students. Still, they had no experience. They had no publications at all. They were all African American. Now, I mean, if you reversed, the other guy, by the way, was white. I was talking about. If you reverse the races here, right, and he and I were black, and the 4 finalists were white people who didn't have PhDs, everybody in this country would be up in arms. That's obvious act of racism, discrimination against us. Seems clear cut, but. And we actually had attorneys approach us who wanted the case. I didn't pursue it, but it's not common. It's daily. There's racist and sexist discrimination practiced by colleges and universities in this country every single day in admissions, in faculty hiring, in promotion, in tenure appointments, all of it. across the board.
I consider this idea of diversity, where they try to look at equity rather than equality.
Right.
I consider it a socialist idea. I think it comes from partly Sweden, actually.
Sure.
Because we started with what we call gender mainstreaming back in 1994.
Yeah, it's social engineering.
Yes.
And Swedes are very good at that, I've heard.
Yes, we have a Swedish Gender Equality Agency.
Right.
Yeah, their goal is to make everything 50-50.
Yeah.
Yeah, 50% men, 50% women.
That's right.
Right.
Social engineering.
Funnily enough, the entire leadership is female.
I know.
100. You know this?
I do.
How come? Who's been gossiping?
I might have listened to Aaron Flam at some point.
Well, I want to thank you so much for stopping by the podcast. I hope to have you as a guest again. I hope to get you to Sweden, or at least I know Alexander Bard really wants to get you to Sweden.
That's what I hear, yeah. Yes. Alexander, let's go. Let's do it. Get me on American Idol. We'll make a deal.
And I have a t-shirt for you.
Oh, awesome.
Yes, it's this one.
Cool. What does this say?
It says, crush socialism.
How do you pronounce that?
Krossa socialismen.
All right.
And this is my silhouette. This is me walking in the May Day parade in Sweden with the sign that says
Crush
this
socialism
on the front. On the back, it says socialism is evil, but then I put a heart there
to confuse them.
No, well, or partly to confuse them, which is quite easy to do, but also because I want to remind people we don't want to crush people, but ideas in this case.
I see. So you're not. But the color red is a little scary.
I know, but it's also the color of sex.
It symbolizes three things, right? Communism, sex, and blood. So
true.
I don't
all
know.
Dirty and in some ways sexy.
There you go.
Yes.
Thanks. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Deconstructive Criticism with this episode's guest, Thaddeus Russell. If you want to know more about Thaddeus, please visit his website. Links to both it and the news articles referenced in the introduction can be found on aronflam.com. That's aronflam.com. Thank you for supporting Deconstructive Criticism via Patreon, where you will find me by searching for my name, Aaron Flam, that's Aaron with one A and Flam with one M, or supporting it via PayPal, Bitcoin, or Swish 0768 943737. 0768 943737. Every donation helps, and you will find links to your preferred way of support in the description of this episode, regardless of what platform you're using. There's also a link to my webpage, aronflam.com, where you will find t-shirts with uplifting messages such as crush socialism, socialism is evil, or your feelings are hurting my thoughts, which is this podcast's creed. At aronflam.com you will also find my book, This is a Swedish Tiger, albeit only in Swedish for now. This is a Swedish Tiger reveals what the Swedes really did during the Second World War and how, via cooperation with Islamists, never really stopped. By the time you hear me say this, the English translation is done, but I'm still looking for publishers in different countries. This is a Swedish Tiger has sold out 2 editions in Swedish by now, so finding a publisher shouldn't be too hard, and if you are one listening to this, please get in touch via, for instance, Twitter. The audiobook, in Swedish as well, will be released by the end of February, and the ebook around the same time. All will be available at aronflam.com. My name is Aaron Flam, and until next time, have a good unit of time.